Just to remind you that the bios for each of our panelists have a link that provides much more information about their new book. So I'm just repeating that the two panels and the keynote speech today are all based on forthcoming books that will be coming out in the next few weeks and months. So do keep an eye out for them. So at this point, I would like to turn to the director of the Grace School, David Wellman, to moderate our very first session. David, over to you.
Thank you so very much, Jeff, and good morning to everyone. We're so delighted that you're here with us. So the project of diplomatic training lies at the heart of the work of many scholars of our field. The histories, geographies, and politics reflected in the training of diplomats illumines both the past and the trajectory of the future of diplomatic practice. And this morning, we are very pleased to feature three panelists whose recent work has engaged this theme in new and very creative ways. They are Fiona McConnell of Oxford University, who joins us today from Oxford. Jonathan Harris of Dublin City University, who joins us from Belfast. And Sam Okoth Opondo of Vassar College, who joins us from Poughkeepsie, New York. For a detailed biography of each of our speakers, please see the link to our panelists' bios, which was emailed to everyone who RSVP'd for our conference. The bios for each of the panelists has a link to a flyer for their forthcoming book, which is the inspiration for this roundtable. After our panel's presenters share their initial remarks, we'll have a question and answer portion to allow you, the audience, to submit written questions via the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen. And the moderator, myself, will direct your questions to the individual speakers or to all the panelists. So let's now turn to our panelists, and to that end, I would now like to give the floor to Fiona.
Very many thanks, David, and to you and Jeff for the invitation to be with you today. Let me just sort out sharing my screen with you. Hopefully you can see that.
We can. It's coming on.
Excellent. I'd also like to extend my thanks to Mildred and Manda for all the coordination work that goes on behind the scenes for these kind of conferences, and always a real pleasure to be participating at the Grace School International Conference. So what I want to do in my presentation is a quite simple task, and it's to make the case for focusing attention on diplomatic training. So very much kind of trying to set the scene for Jonathan and Sam's presentations. So some high-level comments about why and how we might examine diplomatic training before they tackle the topic in more empirical and conceptual detail. So as David said, this panel is linked to an edited book that Jonathan, Ruth Craggs, and I have been pulling together, and that Sam and Jeff have chapters in. The book is coming out in the Key Studies of Diplomacy series of Manchester University Press in February next year. So in the time that I have, I want to set the context of this wider project, where it's come from, why we think diplomatic training is interesting, and some key themes around the histories, politics, and geographies of diplomatic training. So to start really with the landscape of diplomatic training in very broad brushstrokes. To paraphrase Kissinger, diplomacy is both an art and a science. Learning through experience and on-the-job training has always been important, but there's also been formal modes of training, and these have been growing in importance in the past century. As I'll discuss shortly, formalized diplomatic training is a fairly new endeavor in the context of global diplomatic history, with the first formal courses in diplomacy only beginning in the 1700s. From these beginnings, the principle that diplomats can be taught has been established and grown to become a global phenomenon on which vast amounts of time and funding is expended annually. So today, most states host diplomatic academies or institutes that train their own diplomatic staff, and many states also offer training to diplomats from other countries. In addition to these government-run courses, diplomatic education more broadly is offered by a really wide range of other providers. There are specialized institutions offering degrees in diplomacy. So some university courses have close links with national governments, whilst others solely reflect the interests of those institutions and the academics who teach on those courses. Increasingly, this kind of formalized landscape of diplomatic education is also being supplemented by training provided by private consultancies, which often employ former diplomats to deliver their training. And then there's also a range of informal training provided pro bono and on an ad hoc basis. So diplomatic training across these different providers usually includes a mix of knowledge-based content, so courses in law, international politics, international economics, alongside skills-based aspects. So looking at communique drafting, how to host meetings, negotiations, and protocol. So whilst there remains a sense of what Paul Sharp calls, to quote, an independently existing diplomatic culture with its own sense of the world, end quote, that very much lies beyond the confines of any taught curriculum. At the same time, training is becoming increasingly ubiquitous and influential in diplomacy in the 21st century. Yet, despite the increasing importance of diplomatic training, there has to date been very little academic attention paid to the subject. Some trainers have themselves written textbooks and course materials, and they've reflected on their practice in biographies. However, there's notably no mention of diplomatic training in key texts on diplomacy, and no specific entry in the Encyclopedia of Diplomacy. The research that there has been has focused primarily on the role of diplomatic schools as sites where international relations is taught and shaped, or on the specific cases, which include, for example, Martin Muller's work on the formation of geopolitical subjects at the Moscow State Institution of International Relations, or the likes of Mary Kusa's work on the transformations of European diplomatic fields and how those are reflected in the training of diplomats, or Dosati Bailon's examination of identity work at the French Diplomatic and Consular Institute. So aside from those very specific cases, this gap on focusing on diplomatic training more generally reflects a wider failure to address training more broadly in academic research. Training is often seen as both too technical and simply too boring to warrant critical attention. Yet, we'd argue that it's anything but. Training is both ubiquitous, who doesn't undertake it in their working lives, a core site of socialization, of network building, and training is also a crucial connection between the academy and professional practice across a wide range of fields. So as a result of this central role in shaping diplomats and diplomatic practice internationally, we seek to conceptualize diplomatic training as a political and as a pedagogical encounter, as a site of active knowledge production, as well as a venue for network building, and soft power. Moreover, the coherence of diplomacy as a profession is maintained partially through training, because training is crucial to the inculcation of professional standards and of networks. So diplomatic training therefore reflects and reproduces diplomacy itself in a series of different ways. And more broadly, and something that Jeff and Yolanda Spies picks up in their chapter, diplomatic training is a crucial site in the making of international relations. Training provision reflects hegemonic visions of the international world and the priorities of its funders, whether provided for domestic cohorts or those internationally as a form of aid or cooperation. However, in bringing together trainers and learners in the same classroom, diplomatic training also offers opportunities for mutual learning and for the contestation of hegemonic visions of the present and future of international relations. And it's these interscalar dynamics that have been really key to how we've approached and sought to conceptualize diplomatic training. So the volume then, it emerged out of a project Jonathan, Ruth Craggs and I had undertaken on the training of African diplomats in the period of decolonisation, which will be the focus of Jonathan's talk shortly. And through this, we had the privilege of interviewing former trainers and trainees across a range of programmes. And extracts from two of those interviews with Guy Martin and Stephen Chan are included in the volume. So contributors include academic researchers, former diplomats, and directors and trainers on training programmes, ranging across Nairobi, Yaoundé, The Hague, Tehran, Addis Ababa, Chicago, and Oxford. So in bringing this range of voices of both academics and practitioners together, we're looking at diplomatic training as both practice and object of critical reflection. So what I want to do next is give a kind of really whistle-stop tour of some of the histories of diplomatic training, with the caveat that is a kind of Western history of this. And I'll pick up on some caveats on that shortly. So diplomacy for most of its history and in most of the world has been practiced by social and political elites. Prior to the mid-20th century, envoys and ambassadors were typically drawn from aristocratic classes, or they acted as diplomats in addition to their primary occupation, whether that was as a soldier, religious leader, merchant, or the like. So rather than formal training, what qualified a diplomat was their social standing, quite often family ties, as well as skills, knowledge, and networks that they accumulated through experience. In Europe, formal training finds its beginnings with a French experiment, the Académie de Politique, which ran from 1712 to 1721. As Maurice Keene Soper has documented, though it was perceived to be a failure and it was closed soon after the death of its first director, the Académie established, quote, a body of knowledge about international relations, coherent enough to be taught, useful enough to be absorbed, and relevant enough to be applied to the practice of diplomacy. So this idea of a diplomatic academy was taken up elsewhere in Europe, most notably with what is now the world's longest standing diplomatic training institution, the Vienna Diplomatische Academy, which was founded in 1754. And with the growing global power of European empires through the 19th century, we see a kind of increasingly coherent and hegemonic European diplomatic culture emerging, the so-called old diplomacy. And Laurence Bidel's account of this period, she theorizes three kind of schools as diplomatic professionalization emerged. First, a French school, which focused on history, a German school focused on training in law, and a British school focused on the classics, literature, and philosophy. Notably, all three traditions were very much linked to national elites, and the practice of diplomacy remained largely the preserve of men from aristocratic families. A significant shift to what would be known as the new diplomacy came following the First World War and the negotiation of the Paris Peace Conference, which brought about change in the diplomatic profession in terms of both skills and personnel. The rise of the US as a global power also prompted internal reflection on the preparedness of its diplomatic service to execute foreign policy. And as a result, the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service was founded in 1919. And interestingly, Father Edmund Walsh, its first director, framed diplomacy as a profession in itself lacking a tradition of training. To quote him, he wrote, "We train for medicine, we train for law, we train for divinity, we train for all the scientific professions. Shall the candidate for foreign service alone stand an outcast among the learned?" End quote. So the Second World War and the collapse of European empires then led to a high demand for diplomatic training, as new foreign ministries were quickly set up in independent states across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. And training, as we've traced in our research, was often offered by former colonial powers, where courses that had formerly trained colonial officers were repurposed as programs for foreign diplomats. So in sum, we suggest that focusing on these historical developments of diplomatic training offers some initial insights then into the evolution of diplomacy as a profession. In the first instance, the fact that it's taken a long time for formal diplomatic training to become a universal trend reflects the relatively late emergence of diplomacy as a profession. But on the flip side, the rapid demand for and provision of formalized training in the wake of decolonization and multilateralism centers training as key to how the coherence of diplomacy as a profession is sought to be maintained. Yet, as the chapters in the book demonstrate, the extent to which training homogenizes the knowledge of diplomacy is also very much contested. So indeed, the sites, the spaces, the networks, we were three geographers bringing this book together, so we're obviously interested in these distinct geographies that underpin diplomatic training, and through which we can trace a series of complex power relations, because we argue that diplomatic training is inherently political. We trace these through a range of scales, starting with the scale of the body in terms of what diplomatic training can tell us about who diplomats are and have been over time. So here, chapters in the book reflect on the elitism of diplomacy, including the challenges for certain groups in gaining access to training, but also how diplomatic training contributes towards the trend of pluralization in diplomatic actors as well. We then consider the scale of the classroom and look at how diplomatic pedagogies have changed over time, reflecting wider debates about what diplomacy is and should be. And then finally, we zoom out and think about how diplomatic training is and always has been an international endeavour, which in turn inculcates very particular visions of the international. And the plurality of these visions is picked up powerfully in Sam's chapter, which challenges the purposes of diplomatic training in the post-colonial period. And it very much unsettles those taken for granted fundamentals, such as diplomacy, modernity, and the like within diplomatic training. Instead, revealing how African subjects are already possessing multiple diplomatic worlds well before the training courses ushered in by the approach of sovereign independence. So to wrap up then, by interrogating the intertwined politics and geographies of diplomatic training, we argue that we can gain some insights into diplomacy as a practice. Diplomatic training is never a neutral learning encounter, but rather a space rich with cross-cutting and often uneven relationships, not only between teacher and student, but also often in competing visions for the world. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Fiona. You've just done a wonderful job of laying the groundwork for our conversation today. And it's really wonderful to hear about how your book came together and the people that came to the fore. And we're so fortunate to have our next speaker, who is also central to that project, with us today. So I'd like to turn the floor over to Jonathan now.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much to the team at the Grace School, and thank you, Fiona, for setting me up. I'm going to see if I can share my slides as well. I have plenty of them. Is that coming through?
It is indeed.
It is. Wonderful. Okay. Well, following Fiona's overview of the book, I am going to give an overview of the project that led to the book, which was entitled Training Diplomats of Post-Colonial African States, 1957 to 1997. Fiona and I were team members, but our team leader, who's not with us today, is Ruth Craggs at King's College in London. And as Fiona said, this project started from the realization that diplomatic training is and has been a global phenomenon, but has been understudied as such in historical, geographical, political, and socio-educational scholarship. So we attempt to address that gap, making the key argument that diplomatic training is a crucial site in the making of international relations. It emerged from a desire to bring together elements of international relations as a discipline, historical geography, and education studies, and bring them into conversation, and a realization that doing so could lead to some interesting conceptual advances. So separate to the edited book that we have the privilege of launching for the first time in this panel, we also made a number of original research findings and publications that I'm going to do my best to overview and signpost in the next 10 to 15 minutes. Internationalisms and concepts of international society have long been recognized as fundamentally relational. Critiques of the Eurocentrism of established scholarship on the, quote, expansion of international society, for example, through Adam Getachew's World Making After Empire, have foregrounded interpersonal networks and exchange in the construction of alternative ideas and practices of internationalism. This and other scholarship has increasingly challenged the unpeopled geopolitical vision of much international relations scholarship, and problematize the positionality of the actors who practice international relations and constitute international society, in many cases, diplomats. Inspired by feminist and new materialist approaches, political and historical geographers have in recent years turned to microscale occurrences and practices to extend our scholarly understanding of the international. And brilliant work on placing internationalism and its political construction. A good example here being Stephen Legg and colleagues' recent book has inspired us to be attentive to the microspaces, socio-cultural contexts and atmospheres of international sociability. And our project focused on the period of decolonization from post-colonial Africa is a fresh engagement with what Frank Garrett has described as the ideological scramble for Africa and the pursuit of anti-colonial modernity. So the project focused on training for African diplomats during and directly after decolonization. From the 1950s, African countries emerged from colonial status to represent themselves internationally as sovereign states, triggering an expansion in overseas diplomatic training. Through the 1960s, hundreds of African diplomats in training traveled to the global north to attend bespoke programs run mostly by universities and some diplomatic corps. And this kind of explicit training was something new and points to ways that post-colonial state building was an explicitly international project. These were examples of external provision rather than training provided by states to their own diplomats. They were also mostly university-based courses, but often with strong links to host states or international organizations, and therefore influenced by their agendas and geopolitics. On a methodological note, defining our project focus as we have meant engaging with a wide range of archival sources, spanning those of states, those of institutions like universities, for example, the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and also private archives. As well as doing archival research, which was across both Anglophone and Francophone spaces, we conducted oral histories and interviews with former trainers and trainees wherever possible. Most of the training programs that we identified kept alumni lists and sent these annually to former students in their various postings around the world. And because of this, we have a publicly available and easily formatted list of names that we use to create a new database that we've transformed into a web-based visualization, which is freely accessible on our website. The database is also freely available for download for any scholars wishing to work on it further. As I explain in the linked article here on the slide, this allows for both distant reading and pulling back and seeing the broad picture of where trainee diplomats were going for training in various periods, see here between 1950s and 1990s. But it also allows us to zoom in and go for very close reading, right down to the individuals and tracing the networks that they produced as they made friends and contacts in various different places during their training journey. Oh, and I've animated this. I've forgotten I've done this. So it's interactive. It's manipulatable. And if you're interested, please do go and take a look at that. The late colonial state was a bridge to independence. Officials knew the end was coming, and they sought to manage the speed. Training became a lever for tempo. So either it was too early, and colonial officials would flag requests for diplomatic training as dangerous, or it was too late, and those same officials would use training to justify delay in independence. Independence would require a pipeline of skilled cadres, they argued, so better to wait. On the left of the slide, we have a reproduction from the British Foreign Office archive, which is a list of questions that a potential trainee from what was then called the Gold Coast and later would become Ghana had brought to ask to the protocol department. And they were particularly offended by some of the questions. If you look at question 5, is it proper for the Gold Coast to have any form of representation in a foreign country before achieving full self-government? If so, what should be the nature of that representation and its relationship with the representative of Her Majesty's government? Now, these kinds of questions preempted independence and were therefore politically sensitive and resulted in the trainee being sent home. But Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of independent Ghana, rejected this logic of it being too slow, too fast. His campaign line was clear: seek political independence first, and capacity will follow. Training, in other words, could be read as prudent preparation. And July in 1956, a first flight of 10 trainees were sent to various high commissions around the British Empire. However, the location of training was extremely sensitive, and places like Ottawa in Canada or Canberra in Australia were chosen because they were politically safe. Washington, D.C., on the other hand, was initially avoided due to the colour bar and fears that African trainees might encounter racism or be hostile to British policy if sent to this location. So the when and where of training of people like Ambassador Richard Acquay, who learned during this period, it was clearly important, and the sense of it being a threshold to political independence at the time really comes through in the empirical data. A couple of years later, in 1958, the Rockefeller Foundation in the US gave $3 million to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace to set up what would become, in their director's words, by far the biggest program they ran in the 1960s. This was to train diplomats of newly independent states, again slightly preempting the need that was to come. Between 1960 and 1973, the program trained 360 fellows. Many of these would go on to having glittering diplomatic careers. In the picture on the left, stood in front of the UN building in New York, we have a future Secretary General of the Arab Maghreb Union, Habib Ben Yahya of Tunisia. We also have a later chair of the UN Fifth Committee, Conrad Mzee of Tanzania. These fellows came from a wide range of states and were sent either to New York or to Geneva for training. Geneva was bilingual, teaching in French and English, and the training in New York was Anglophone. And you can see here a kind of linguistic division between those who were sent to the Anglophone New York training and those who were sent to the bilingual / Francophone training in Switzerland, in Geneva. This activity was unambiguously framed by those involved in running the program as an investment in the human ingredients of peace. And inherently intangible as the results may have been, this was the hope through to the end. It was very much therefore focused on personal connections and building a sense of social solidarity through things like excursions and visits, for example, here to Cyprus in 1963, or to local factories, this one in Geneva on the right. That socialization was mostly with one another across the new diplomats of newly independent states. It was also at times on invitation to various embassies and groups. One key group that inserted itself into this training was the Quakers, the American Friends Service Committee, which ran an annual conference on Lake Geneva, which initially was to do with bringing the diplomats of the political West into contact with the diplomats of the political East at the height of the Cold War. But in 1961 and 1962, welcomed the trainees of the Carnegie Endowment diplomatic training program you can see here. This was certainly a case of socialization into the kind of liberal internationalism that was hoped at the time to provide the foundation for future international society. We talk about socialization because of the established literature in international relations scholarship on socialization as being a way that norms are internalized by political actors, mostly states, and then diffused in the international sphere. In our research, we take it from the scale of the state and think more about the socialization in the classroom. We can see in the examples from the Quaker archives that trainers agreed that diplomatic practice could not be didactically taught through things like lectures, but instead needed to be subject to a kind of flexible, autonomous, collaborative learning, which was somehow extremely shrouded in mystery as to what exactly it entailed and required. So a quote from the Quaker Archives, communication of information is of minor importance as compared with the exchange of views, which will, hopefully, lead to better understanding. Unfortunately, the experiment with the Quakers didn't work. The levels of cultural difference between those of the global north and global south appear to have been greater than the vast political gulf between the socialist east and the capitalist west. Continuing in this vein of thinking through the interconnection of scale between interpersonal relationships and interstate relationships or international relationships, we flesh out a concept of what we call post-colonial tutelage in order to interrogate the international and interpersonal dynamics of these post-colonial entanglements happening in the classroom of diplomatic training. There are also temporal dynamics, again, that come in at this stage. Too slow, too fast. In these quotes from Reggie Dumas, who was a trainee on the Carnegie Endowment course and was in the last photograph with the Quakers, he actually wrote his own memoirs and quotes his evaluation of the course, writing in 1961. And he says, I think, looking back, that the one major gap in some of the courses and seminars was the lack of a feeling of immediacy. We are young countries in a hurry. We have to be up to date. We have to learn in a few years what it took other countries 50 and 100 years. And against this sense of a need of urgency, he counters with the sense that the trainers had a sense of paternalism towards the trainees, that there was a flexibility of approach, sympathetic, and even a lowering of standards. Now, this kind of post-colonial tutelage wasn't just a one-way street. Back in Geneva, the international economist Gilbert Etienne was very much concerned that by lowering standards and producing graduates who were not prepared to, quote, take on tasks that their Western colleagues will only take on after long years of practical experience, decided to instigate tests for the students. But this was resisted by those same students. And in the same year, in December 1965, they gathered together for a General Assembly to sign off on a document saying, we, the undersigned trainees of the Carnegie Endowment, gathered for a General Assembly, considering our reasons as explained to the various directors of the course, have decided not to take the tests prepared for us. And we point to this as an example of the tension of tutelage, of students needing to use the skills that they have been taught in diplomacy in order to take steps towards independence, but that the relationship between tutor and tutee comes with an inherent power imbalance that is hard to overcome and break free from. And coming into the end, but one obvious outworking of some of these tensions was that training should cease to be undertaken outside of Africa, particularly in Europe and North America. And as Ali Mazrui in 1961 noted, perhaps diplomacy, like charity, must begin at home. So very quickly, again, the Carnegie courses started to run what they called seminars of several weeks in various different capitals around Africa. And one that would later become the Institute of International Relations of Cameroon, which is still there today and was the first international school for diplomats on the African continent, began to run from 1966. And the English-speaking Prime Minister of the time of Anglophone Cameroon said, fraternity and international peace are not independent of man and his training. They're intimately linked to the ideals that inform his character, to his capacity to understand the problems of his time, and finally, to his sense of duty. So he's articulating ways in which training for diplomacy was part of an African renewal, but also a Cameroonian one, and that the bilingual experiment in training for diplomats was also part of a bilingual experiment of reunification of Cameroon in the post-independence period. Our last paper that I want to flag extends this kind of thinking into the later period of the 1970s and 80s, when the new international economic order was the order of the day. The United Nations adopted this new international economic order and made it part of the mission of UNITAR, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, to put it in place. And part of the way that they did that was through training. And here's an example of participants in a seminar, which was billed as a North-South seminar set in Vienna. This was an annual occurrence, bringing together junior diplomats from Global North and Global South to think through ways that development diplomacy could be put into action and this new international economic order could be achieved. And we, in our paper in Antipode, make the case that these spaces of diplomatic training were therefore also spaces of anti-colonial world making, where the whole design of the world system was up for review, and where students were not only learning about it, but were thinking through ways in which it might be changed. I've definitely gone over time, so I'm going to stop there. But if you want to find out more, our website has blogs, links to publications, and links to those maps. You're very, very welcome to go there. So thank you.
Jonathan, thank you so very much for what you've brought to the table here. I find it quite fascinating to see how the training of diplomats in former colonies reflects the evolution of their countries domestically. That's just a really wonderful window. So at this time, I'd like to turn now to our presentation by our third panelist, Sam Okoth Opondo. But before he begins, I just want to extend an invitation to our audience members to post questions through the Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen, which I'll be so very delighted to convey to our panelists following Sam's presentation. So the floor is now yours, Sam. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, David and Jeff, for inviting me for the conference. And I also want to thank Jonathan, Ruth, and Fiona for inviting me to contribute to the edited book. My chapter is the last one in the book, and it takes a little bit of a different turn, in that I'm thinking about diplomatic fictions. And I'd also like to thank Jonathan for offering some of the archival material that really brought more nuance to what I was reading. Based on, I was reading the fiction and having some of the archival material on the Diplomatic Training Institute really broadened how I was thinking about the project. I'll read some of my remarks and then just, in the interest of time, so as be able to move a little bit faster. My chapter in the book, which is titled Postcolonial Diplomatic Fictions and as Diplomatic Training, offers an extended reflections on the fictions of diplomacy and diplomatic fictions in postcolonial East Africa by interarticulating insights from postcolonial studies, African literary texts like Okoth texts, Song of Lawino and Song of Ochol, with those from the growing field of Diplo literary studies. I look at often overlooked diplomacies, sites of African estrangement, mediation practices, and diplomatic subjects and subjectivities. Sorry, I'll just try and set my clock so I don't go for too long. Okay. Yeah. Based on an interrogation of the multiple forms of training that Africans have been subjected to as both colonial and diplomatic subject, the essay moves between the fictions of the diplomatic subject emerging from the University of Nairobi's diplomacy training program founded in 1973, the now famed 1968 memo calling for the abolition of the English department at the University of Nairobi, what is termed as the Nairobi Revolution, which is central to postcolonial studies, and the 1962 Diplomatic Training Institute, and another event, the 1962 Conference of African Writers of English Expression held at Makerere University. Among other things, I turn to the questions raised by these pedagogical sites to think more critically about what counts as diplomatic training and which African sites, subjectivities, knowledge, and practices can be considered to be of diplomatic significance. Here, I contest the claim that many newly independent African states initially relied on untrained diplomats by illustrating that the very process of colonizing Africans always carried a pedagogical imperative that simultaneously de-diplomatizes and estranges the African through conversion, training, commandment, governance, and other forms of translation and socialization, and then puts them in a world where they have to mediate their estrangement in new ways while offering new fictions and training practices that then diplomatizes the Africans in new, tragic, and often now recognizable ways. And we could think of how this has implications for multiple things. Jonathan spoke about the Quakers and the peace studies efforts that you get to see in African peace building efforts today. There's a religiosity to it. Yeah, you could think of Uganda, which is one of the places that I focus on. Yeah, that evangelical practices. Yeah, people like Rick Warren have worked with Uganda such that it's now thought of as the first purpose-driven nation. And we see that in the anti-homosexuality bill and other things in that place. Two recent efforts served as a provocation for this chapter. The first event received little media attention, but is worth paying attention to, especially within the context of this conference, not just the chapter itself, but I want to try and connect this to the theme of the conference. It relates to a February 2023 announcement by the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry website that more than 200 diplomats from Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, Ivory Coast, South Africa, Botswana, Mozambique, and Senegal will be undertaking, and this is what it says, a comprehensive four-day training course at the Hynedy Udovenko Diplomatic Academy in Ukraine, where they will be trained on security and diplomacy in wartime Ukraine experience with the objective of countering influence operations. The second event, which was a provocation for the chapter, received considerable media attention, went viral on social media, and became the subject of much talk about the African principled position. Yeah, so the question of Africans' principled position on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also the subjectivity and eloquent speech given by the Kenyan ambassador Martin Kimani, who was the representative to the UN. Paying attention to how the African diplomat's speech has been covered and recovered by those interested in the form and not only the content of the speech itself tells us a lot about the image of the African diplomat, as well as the idea and ideal of training that often accompanies it. That is, when the world listened to Martin Kimani, what people heard was an eloquent history lesson about territorial integrity and African borders that were not of our own drawing. Though presentist, the short history lesson provided also broke from the dominant discourse of those present at the UN. It is worth noting that a lot of attention was paid to Kimani's training too. The media focused on his professional achievements, his PhD in war studies from King's College London, as well as an undergraduate degree from the University of New Hampshire that helped cut the image of both a skilled ambassador and a polemologist who had authored a text on the atrocities in Rwanda titled The Work of War. Those who dug deeper painted the image of a figure who understands institutional power and the politics of the Horn of Africa, as he had been the director of the Conflict Early Warning Mechanism and the National Counterterrorism Center, and has acted as a special envoy for countering violent extremism in Kenya. What received little media attention was Kimani's deep connections to Kenya's literary community of a certain generation. In addition to his many roles, he was a key contributor to the literary journal Kwani and was good friends and worked very closely with fiction writers like the late Binyavanga Wainaina of the How to Write About Africa fame. In short, Kimani understands the power of speech and writing. In both his amateur and professional mediatory capacities, he has taken very seriously the relationship between narrative, materiality, power, and violence, such that his geography, history, and civics lessons and his diplomatic articulations are also statements about the aesthetics and metaphysical order of things. It is important to heed the historical context for the current ethical and political positions taken by African diplomats, whether it's on the question of Ukraine, as we are seeing with Martin Kimani, or the South African position on Palestine, and to be able to see how these positions have got a long history. To do so effectively, we need to attend to the historical processes and sites of the training of African diplomats that take colonial alienation seriously, raise questions about the multiple ways of negotiating this negation, and attempt to engage and resist the ways that Africans have been incorporated into but placed at the bottom of a European-inspired moral universe and a diplomatic order, complete with its moral sentiments, laws, wars, linguistic maps, and the related idea of Africa and the world. As I mentioned earlier, and again, this was a little bit writing in response to a very short sentence in Jonathan, Ruth, and Fiona's text, where they noted that the post-colonial state initially relied on untrained, and I wanted to think a little bit on the question of the untrained diplomats drawn from anti-colonial movements, especially their elites educated abroad. Instead, I would like to point to how the supposedly untrained African diplomat is actually very well trained in mediation practices, even if their own knowledge emerges from spaces, forms, and venues and cultures of diplomacy that might not register as diplomatic, owing to the colonial regime of recognition or diplomacy or disciplinary training that might not be considered as sites of diplomatic training. I've spoken about the primary institutions, but in my chapter, I do a lot of reading of Okoth Opondo fiction, or rather poetry. And I'll just, to give it a sense of the chapter, I'll read a short excerpt from the chapter from the Song of Lawino, just to be able to give a sense. So this is the more poetic element of it. So I'm thinking about the poetics of diplomacy. Here is the words of Lawino from the Song of Lawino. And she says, "Husband, now you despise me. Now you treat me with spite and say I have inherited the stupidity of my aunt. Son of the chief, now you compare me with the rubbish in the rubbish pit. You say you no longer want me because I'm like the things left behind in the deserted homestead. You insult me, you laugh at me, you say I do not know the letter A because I have not been to school and I have not been baptized. Listen, Ocho, you're the son of a chief. Leave foolish behavior to little children. It is not right that you should be laughed at in a song. Songs about you should be songs of praise. Stop despising people as if you are a little foolish man. Stop treating me like saltless ash. Become barren of insults and stupidity." And then I'll just read a little bit lower on that point, just to give a little more context. And this is Lawino continuing. I do not understand the way of foreigners, but I do not despise their customs. Why should you despise yours? Listen, my husband, you're the son of a chief. The pumpkin in the old homestead must not be uprooted. Listen, my clansman, I cry over my husband whose head is lost. Ochol has lost his head in the forest of books. When my husband was still wooing me, his eyes were still alive, his ears were still unlocked. Ochol had not yet become a fool. My friend was a man then. My husband has read much. He has read extensively and deeply. He has read among white men, and he is clever like white men, and the reading has killed my man. In the ways of his people, he has become a stump. As Lawino lament illustrates, one of the most tragic elements of this colonial dressage and training is that it made characters like Ochol forget their positions and disposition as the son of an Acholi chief and the kind of knowledge and bodily practices he was supposed to embody. The replacement of one form of training, that is, of Ochol as an Acholi chief son and diplomatic subject, with another, colonial mission education and taste, is of diplomatic significance and is worth revisiting in light of the quest for a better understanding of the training of post-colonial African diplomats. Mahmoud Mamdani provides some historical context of this kind of rule, identity formation, and knowledge regime at play in poems like Okoth Opondo text, such that the chiefhood to which Lawino constantly refers could be either a pre-colonial entity or a colonial institution invented or retooled for purposes of colonial rule. And this phenomenon, as we see, plays out in multiple contexts. That was reading from a text like Okoth Opondo poetry. But we also see the diplomatic significance of such texts when people like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in the opening chapter of his Decolonizing the Mind, decries the study of African realities in terms of tribes, which deflects people from seeing that imperialism is still the root of many problems in Africa, thus making it impossible for people to see the divide and rule colonial origins of most social conflicts, end of quote. To demonstrate that the colonial system, what the colonial system had done to Kenyan children and the human perception of reality, Ngugi goes on to give an account of his own colonial education and literary training as he retraces the route from the Berlin Conference of 1884 to the Makerere Conference that I mentioned earlier, which was the conference of African writers of English expression. So he's asking, what is the condition of possibility for there being an African writers of English expression? In order to understand that, you have to understand the Berlin Conference and the scramble and partition of Africa, such that you have got Lusophone Africa, Francophone Africa, Anglophone Africa, the very linguistic mapping of Africa. And he says that we have to connect that to what is still prevailing and the dominant logic 100 years later, where the colonial order of knowledge still frames how Africans value and encounter each other, how they make claims to knowledge, and how they are recognized on the world stage. This being the case, investigating how post-colonial African diplomats were trained raises critical questions about African gnosis and diplomatic gnosis by interrogating the apparatuses, institutions, methods of knowledge, investigation, and even acquaintance with someone that are privileged in any given society. Rather than rehearsing the geopolitical significance of a conference like the Makerere Conference as a site of Cold War diplomacy that was funded by the CIA, established Congress for Cultural Freedom, I use these dynamics of fiction, estrangement, recognition, and genre, and the training that Ngugi highlights to explore how some of the questions posed by African literature and philosophy can help us raise critical questions about diplomacy and the programmatic training of African diplomats while exploring the interplay of diplomatic and colonial fictions, knowledge and desire, and their relationship to the arts of the South and the crafts of dealing with the other. As a site of diplomatic training and professionalization, the course content of the 1962 Institute, which Jonathan spoke to at length, also focused on things like economics and law rather than the broader conception of diplomacy, thus creating some of the trained-in capacities that became part of the economy of diplomatic knowledge and affiliation. It is as a result of these trained-in capacities that one's very abilities can function as a blindness and create the inability to respond adequately to situations different from those that one had been trained to or as an African or post-colonial diplomat. While the aforementioned effort to train post-colonial African diplomats may appear novel, it must be read within the historical context of its emergence. Taking this longer historical or genealogical view reveals how some of the institutions participating in the diplomatization of post-colonial African today, and as much as in the past, were invested in the colonization and de-diplomatization of Africans by turning them into colonial subjects unworthy of diplomatic recognition, or local despots who facilitated colonial extraction and domination. Mahmoud Mamdani has a kind of continuity thesis where he's illustrating how the institutional effort and ideological commitment to train or untrain African diplomats and some early effort at containerizing of subject peoples through institutions of indirect rule distributed despotism and produced what one might call a customary realm, leading to the kinds of things that we're seeing in Okoth Opondo text, poetry, and even in Ngugi wa Thiong'o's text. Just in the interest of time, I want to draw on some of the implications of thinking about this for diplomatic theory. Doubtless, the exploration of diplomatic fictions and fictions of diplomacy is not new, as there is a long history of diplomats, novelists, and diplomat poets, from Pablo Neruda, people like Frantz Fanon and others, as well as the very notion that diplomatic spaces are sites of aesthetic production, representation, and consumption. We can get to think of diplomatic gifts, museums, and other sites. However, as Constantino illustrates, we need to pay attention to another sense of diplomatic fiction. And this is characterized by the fiction of the sovereign subject, the fiction of the representative agent, or the instrumentalized object, and a specialized process, how these have become to be considered as part of the production of a newborn or trainee diplomat as they enter into a new semiotic world with a series of unintelligible signs. Taking diplomatic fiction seriously in this broader sense enables us to illustrate not only how diplomacy disciplines the body to its rituals, rules, and protocols of civility, but also the other fictions that it produces, the state form and the institutions, among others. Conventional and even critical accounts of this process of becoming a diplomat often present it as an act of learning of the art of diplomacy. So what Fiona spoke to at the beginning, that Kissinger quote, which in this sense has to be broadened so that we do not only think of it as the production of the professional diplomat, but how it becomes a process of dealing with the other, dealing with the self, and dealing with new things just as one does in early childhood, end of quote. This form of far-reaching education, even if substandard, was central to the colonial project, where colonized subjects were required to learn many things about many worlds, to learn new languages other than their own, and every days of being that estranged them from themselves and their communities. Like the trainee diplomat, the colonized subject was an estranged being thrown into a world of foreign signs and problematic cultural discourses. As a result of the racial regimes of recognition and intelligibility, colonial subjects were translated into Western linguistic, cartographic, aesthetic, and moral codes that projected them onto the world while emphasizing their difference or their particularity. If diplomacy requires attentiveness, and here I'm quoting James Dadarian, to the social practices of the everyday life of its bearers, then our conception of diplomatic training in Africa will have to engage the pedagogical, aesthetic, and spiritual production of the figure of the native or the civilized African diplomat that takes place alongside what Achille Mbembe calls the forms of commandment, a colonial rationality and creed of power that makes the native the prototype of the animal or thing to be altered at will. I won't go in depth on the implications of this, but as Jonathan spoke about in his presentation, we see how we have got texts like The World Making After Empire by Adam Getachew that illustrate how it's not just the colonial space wasn't just a site where Africans were acted upon, but they come together. It's a kind of Pan-African ethos to contest these domains, but it impacts on even the sites of diplomatic training. Yeah, Africans not being brought to the US, yeah, because the diplomats are thought of as becoming radicalized, yeah, because you encounter Jim Crow and also encounter a Pan-African consciousness. So to be able to see how diplomatic training and the colonial projects were a kind of coeval emergent of those is something that I was very interested in doing in this chapter. So I'll stop there and maybe invite other questions.
Well, thank you so very much. I want to say, as we diplomatically walk through this new world that you have just spoken of, I cannot think of a better volume for everybody to acquire, which is the wonderful book that our three panelists have been central to creating. And I just want to say again that you can find a link to the book in the bios of our three speakers, and I encourage you to acquire it. So at this point in time, I just want to thank Fiona McConnell, Jonathan Harris, Sam Okoth Opondo for your marvelous contributions to this conversation. And I also want to call attention to the fact that we are now going to take a break. We are going to come back at the top of the hour for a really remarkable keynote that will be given to us by Audie Klotz. So have a wonderful break. Thank you again for your time and attention, and we'll look forward to seeing you back at the top of the hour. Thank you.